Are self-piloting or autonomous ships on the way? Susan Riitala and Thor Maalouf are London-based partners in the shipping and transportation group of global law firm Reed Smith. Hello, Susan.
Hi.
And hello, Thor.
Hi, Robert.
Thanks both of you for being with me today. Let me ask this. Let me start with you, Thor. Where are we at this moment in the development of autonomous vessels in terms of where they are, how many they are, what size and kinds of ships?
Thanks, Robert. Well, I would say we're at the beginning of our journey. There are a few autonomous ships in service. There's a small container ship in Norway that can pilot itself autonomously on short coastal voyages with just a few hundred containers on board. There are research groups in Korea working on fully autonomous navigation systems that can be installed on ships. And we have systems, for example, systems of sails that work autonomously on board non-autonomous cargo ships. So we have autonomous systems already working on board traditional vessels, and we have small autonomous vessels at the moment.
But does even the most prudent and informed ship owner know enough about artificial intelligence and software to accurately determine what's needed to operate an autonomous vessel safely, especially when there's no crew on board? Thor?
Well, interesting you mentioned that, Robert, because an autonomous vessel isn't necessarily one that does not have crew on board. There are different degrees of autonomy that that are being used to categorize autonomous vessels. In terms of what the ship owner knows, you're quite right, Robert, because within shipping, we talk about a concept of seaworthiness of a ship. And typically, a ship owner will be obliged to exercise due diligence to make sure that a ship is seaworthy before a voyage, before it sets out. Now, traditionally, that would encompass things like making sure that nuts and bolts are tightened, that hatches are closed, and the crew is properly trained, things like that. But if now we're talking about an autonomous system potentially incorporating AI on board, how could a traditional ship owner have the knowledge and the expertise to know whether such a system is in working order? Sure, that throws up difficulties. Are ship owners now going to have to employ software experts that are able to get under the hood of autonomous systems in order to understand what's going on and what's driving them in order to make sure things are in a seaworthy state before they start a voyage?
Sounds like the answer is yes. We would need software experts in addition to the traditional engineers and the experts in the physical design and safe operation of a vessel. Are there standards already in place, Thor, for autonomous vessels, or are these still under development?
There are some standards in place. So the IMO is working on a framework, a marine autonomous surface ship mass code. So the idea in the development of that code is that the IMO will have a voluntary code in place sometime next year, so in 2026. And the view is that then going forward from them, they might work on a compulsory code. So at the moment, there's little in the way of regulation, but it is in the pipeline. So the IMO are working on it.
Well, if the IMO's standards in the past are any indication, it certainly would become mandated at some point, I would think. Susan, who would regulate these ships going forward on a national and international basis? And what types of regulations can we expect to see in the future related to autonomous vessels?
Yeah, thanks, Robert. So I think obviously the IMO code is the kind of important headline one there, and autonomous ships would still need to be flagged with a flag state. They would need to be registered somewhere, and each flag state would then have their own requirements, some more stringent than others. And they would also need to be classed by a classification society exactly the same as a non-autonomous ship would. So classification societies will also be quite relevant in determining what kind of regulation, what sort of things you need to do to make sure that your ship is operating properly. And actually, those might then vary across the classification societies. And that's not to say that there wouldn't then also be national regulation, and there already is some that we've seen in other countries, but ultimately most of it, I expect, will be really at the flag and class level, because it will just be the same as other vessels. It may very well be also that if there are incidents that happen, that will then drive further regulation, as Thor mentioned about vessels not necessarily being entirely autonomous. So if you may need to have some people on board just from a safety perspective anyway, even if most of the operations are autonomous.
But not at the helm. I mean, it sounds like, the AI or the automated system would actually be steering and running the ship, if my understanding of the word autonomous. But Susan, when we get into this kind of thing, insurance always comes up as a topic. What kind of insurance products are already available for autonomous vessels? Because I'm thinking the premiums would be prohibitively expensive, at least in the early days of the technology being put into service.
I think that is probably right. One of the issues around the insurance at the moment is that there aren't that many really big vessels that are certainly fully autonomous. A lot of the autonomous vessels are much smaller support vessels, and insuring them is perhaps slightly more, could be a bit more free about that, because the risk is not as high. There are insurance products available. So the Ship Owners Club, for example, offers an all risks insurance, which is covering pollution, covering collisions, covering P&I, similar to any normal ship policy. Guard is also offering some hull and machinery and P&I products. So the products are there. Certainly, I expect that over time we'll see kind of more bespoke products coming out as the autonomous vessels develop, as they become more prevalent. It certainly would be the case that probably at the beginning, as you say, the premiums could be higher, but obviously the cost of the technology is already pretty high. And as they become more and more common, then it will probably even out over time.
Well, there's so much sensitivity these days on ships that actually have human pilots. We saw what happened in the Suez Canal, the blockage there. We saw what happened at the Francis Scott Key Bridge at the Port of Baltimore. There was a crew on the ship that collided with that bridge. So I would think people would be super sensitive to the idea of nobody being at the helm. But this could be a misconception on my part. Thor, are we talking about in the future that we will eventually see gigantic container ships, such as those are in service today, without a human pilot? Will we see them in regular commercial service around the world?
Well, possibly, Robert. If you think about the code that's under development by the IMO at the moment, in the latest iteration of that code, which will be voluntary to begin with, as a minimum, there will be one person in charge of the ship, but that person can be at a remote location. So they could be at a control room, operating the ship remotely.
They have to be on the ship, though, on the ship.
No, they may be connected remotely, dialing in, just like we are dialing into this Zoom.
I see. Well, one hopes that the connection would be a lot more reliable than we're used to with these types of things. If you lose your Wi-Fi, we don't talk to each other. But if you lose that connection in a gigantic cargo ship situation, it could be much worse consequences, I would think. So you're saying that possibly, but my conception of almost this idea of like these gigantic 20,000 TEU ghost vessels running around the world without a pilot at the helm, I guess that isn't really what we're talking about here.
Well, there are different stages of voyages. So whilst I say that the IMO has a minimum standard of at least someone operating remotely, I would have thought that would be the position during the main part of a voyage across an ocean. When we talk about entering a tricky port or a waterway that has currents, tides, shallows that change, I would be very surprised if that section of a voyage where you're bringing the ship into port, you would be allowed to navigate without having a human on board who is a real expert in that waterway. Indeed, it's normal for ships to take on board a pilot specifically trained for a specific port for that leg of the voyage anyway. And I would be very surprised if that ever changed.
Well, that maybe makes me feel a little bit better about the image of these giant ships, at least having some human control at some point. But this is a fascinating conversation. I hope we can continue it going forward because there's so much more to talk about as this technology develops. But in the meantime, I really want to thank you, Susan Riitala and Thor Maalouf of Reed Smith, for talking to me today about this issue. Thanks so much to both of you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Robert.
Robert.